Today we have another edition of our seed oil survival program, and we have a returning guest, someone that we've done a lot of fascinating conversations with over the years. He is a figure who is really advancing to the world the alarming problem, what I think could be the biggest health problem in the last 100 years by far, which is the effects of vegetable oils, seed oils, as they're known online. We have with us renowned Dr. Chris Knobbe. How you doing, sir?
I'm good. How are you, David? Thanks for having
Good.
me on. Nice to
Yeah.
be on the show again.
Yeah. Now we've got a new book out that you've got, and I want to hold it up right now for our audience. The Ancestral Diet Revolution, which is available now. And this book is like, this is going to be the textbook, I think. You know what I mean? This is going to be the exhaustive case against seed oils here on the market, because what you're doing here is you're laying meticulously the data on every approach and on every angle, not just the population studies, which you've kind of made your mark on advancing population studies and trying to go further with that, but also the science of what makes these products so deleterious to our health. But just to set up the frame for those who are new to the topic, and there may be some of you out there, this is about how vegetable oils and processed foods destroy our health and how to recover. This is to prevent, to treat, and often reverse most chronic diseases, including overweight, obesity, heart disease, cancers, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, autoimmune disease, anxiety, depression, and much, much more with natural ancestral dietary change. So this is a very exciting book. I've been enjoying reading through it. And just start off with wherever you want to go here. Why did you put this book together, and what are you hoping to accomplish?
Great question, David. So why did I put this book together? Because by training, I'm an ophthalmologist and I spent my career in ophthalmology, and at the same time, I was suffering with my own arthritis, which was progressive. And I eventually tried, and back in 2011, I tried a paleo diet, which was, at the time at least, for a while, magnificently helpful for my arthritis. And this changed my life, and I wanted to know all I could know about nutrition, and I began investigating. And long story short is I began to connect the dots that, it was processed foods. Well, I didn't connect them. People did for me, like Lauren Cordain and many, many others, Stephan Guyenet, and eventually I came across Weston A. Price's research in 2013, which really just radically changed my life. And I understood that processed foods, nutrient deficient processed foods, were driving all this chronic disease like coronary heart disease, cancers, and metabolic disease. But no one had ever theorized that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 now worldwide. And so I hypothesized that in 2013, and I began to investigate that, and eventually left practice in early 2015 in order to pursue that full time. And lo and behold, all the data supported that hypothesis that it's processed foods, but primarily of those vegetable oils that were driving macular degeneration. And so I went public with that in 2016, and we started a foundation, and I published a paper introducing the hypothesis and wrote a book in regard to that. But by 2018, the more I investigated, David, the more I found that it was the vegetable oils and the high omega-6 diets that were driving so much of this chronic disease. And I felt like this wasn't being covered in the way that maybe I thought I should, or I just felt like I could add to the scientific evidence. And so I began to go public with that in 2019. And I'm really as you know from this book, I'm a data junkie, and I believe you have to prove if you want to try to prove your hypothesis, or I should say support your hypothesis, you need to do that with data. And so that's what I do. And I bring together data about, for example, sugar and vegetable oils, which are the primary markers of processed food, and I lay those in correlation to various chronic diseases like coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, obesity, and so on. And those graphs and that evidence, that paints a picture that you'll not get anywhere else, because you can't do it with words. It just doesn't work. Pictures worth 1,000 words, and that's what these graphs do. Is when you look at those, it's what convinces me. It always did. I remember back before I was going down this path so much, it was Stephan Guyenet's work that was so convincing to me, because he was plotting data like sugar consumption versus disease, and it was so powerfully convincing that I just kind of, in that regard, I followed in his footsteps, and that's basically what I've been doing ever since.
And that goes to the question that a lot of folks have, which is, generally speaking, people are starting online to learn that seed oils are bad, but they kind of lump it into a basket of deplorable food items like processed sugar, processed grains, seed oils, and then other people lump in things like, artificial dyes in children's food is causing alarming problems with mental issues for children. And then they put in things like these gums, carrageenan gum and xanthan gum and all these different things. And so they kind of put it all together into a mix. But how do we chart out what the damage should be laid to? What percentage of the chronic disease and autoimmune problems and mental health issues should be laid at the feet of the seed oils, in contrast to the other factors that are often lumped into the same mushy bad stuff category?
Right. And I think the answer to that, David, is 90% roughly across the board. I think that all the evidence to me shows that the processed foods, and particularly if we want to start splitting out, as you mentioned, how do we decipher, is it processed sugar, or is it processed nutrient deficient refined flours, for example? Are they the primary problem, or is it the vegetable oils? And how do you tease that apart? And the answer is you have to start looking at the data. And for example, I have data, as you'll see in this book and in some of my presentations, that just for example, in the United States, sugar consumption has been going down since 1999. Carbohydrate consumption in the United States has been going down since 1997. Total caloric consumption has been going down in the United States since 2002, or at least it did, all of those for a period of about 15 years. And at the same exact time, obesity had its greatest increases. Type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome had their greatest increases. So we now have a population with it is, if you like in the United States, if you combine the diabetes and the diabetes and the pre-diabetes, you have about 51% of the population, I think, as of 2018, that is, in one of those two categories. And then we know that 88% of the population is not metabolically healthy. And you can say, with another study as of, I think, 2018, 93% of the population cannot meet 5 criteria of cardiometabolic health. Why? What is it that's that many people are consuming that is driving that much disease? And the answer is always vegetable oils. I mean, because people don't recognize these in their food. It's the hidden fat. It's a pernicious and dangerous ingredient that people don't recognize, and because you can't really see it, and you don't really, and there's not been much talk over, throughout all of history about the differences between vegetable oils and animal fats, especially, you know, animal fats that are traditionally raised. And this is how we get into this. And I'll just say right here, David, that, you know, we have similar evidence, as I mentioned, in the United States. You know, in Australia, the carbohydrates and sugar have been going down since the 1960s, and their obesity and diabetes goes through the roof. Sugar has been going down in the United Kingdom since 1961, and their obesity and diabetes all increasing. Japan has some of the greatest evidence. They have, you know, I can get into those details later, but similar situation. You know, you've got sugar. In Japan, you have sugar, carbohydrates, and total calories going down, while their obesity in men, diabetes, cancers, and macular degeneration all through the roof.
Yeah.
Again, so why? What do what are you going to attribute it
right
to?
Here, that's got some
You'll have
interesting.
to back it up a little bit. There we go. There it's coming in.
Go.
There it's coming in. Now, yeah, there we go. Just took a little
bit. You
can
see this is talking about a chart. Edible oils up 322%. That's a 4.22 fold. Global obesity and chronic disease similar from 1961 to 2014. Meanwhile, sugars are up 20% from the same time frame, and carbs are down 1.4%. So you're showing that it's not the carbs and the sugar causing that big spike in global diseases, which is important to know, right? I mean,
well, yeah. Does it? You know, what are you going to attribute it to? If, you know, even on a global scale, if you know, since the 1960s, if carbohydrates have went down 1.4%, I believe it is, and sugars are only up 20%, while we see obesity, I think, doubling in men and approximately tripling in women. If I remember, you've got it right there, David. But yeah. I don't have that quite in my head. But, and you know, we see diabetes going through the roof. But what is it? What is it that's up? Again, even globally, it's the vegetable oils since 1961 or 64, one of those two, have increased 322%. That's 4.22 fold. This is the thing. So what, you know, the whole world is following what the United States has done, which is to gradually replace and supplant animal fats with vegetable oils, because, you know, for the most part, no one recognizes that the vegetable oils are dangerous.
They don't, and yet the data you say shows otherwise. So why are they not able to look at the data? It's pretty amazing. I mean, I'm looking at these charts here.
Because people, for the most part, David, the researchers do not look at population evidence. They do not look at this. Very, very few investigators actually look at population evidence. And I think it's a lot of that goes back to this, you know, this erroneous theory that you can't understand anything, you can't have any answers to anything without a randomized controlled clinical trial. But these trials, they're impossible to run on people when it comes to diet. Why? Because you cannot control diet in people for very long. If you want to completely control a diet in people, you have to put them into basically a hospital type system, into a metabolic ward, and you have to prepare all of their meals, track everything they consume. They can't leave. They must be prisoners of the ward. Otherwise, if they leave, you know, they can go to McDonald's and have a hamburger and French fries and a Coke, and now your study is you know, ruined. And so how long have they done this? Well, about the longest that anyone has ever controlled diets is 6 months. And this is precious few studies have ever gone that long. That is by far about the longest studies where a diet has been completely controlled. So there's been some other studies, you know, like the LA American Veterans Trial, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, you know, some of these, that, you know, the Leon Diet Heart Study, that, you know, have tried to control saturated fat versus vegetable oils, but, you know, overall they didn't do a very good job, and they can't control it for very long. And you have people coming in and going out of the studies, and So again, you can't learn very much, and the time frame is very, very, very short. If you think about most of these diseases that that are most concerning to us, like coronary heart disease and cancers, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, age-related macular degeneration. So many of these disorders, the incubation period is 4 or 5 decades or more. In other words, that's how long you have to have exposure to the noxious agents that are causing the disease in order to produce the disease. And if anybody knows this, if you think about, do any of us know anybody that had a heart attack before age 40? And the answer is it's precious few, right? And how many people know anyone that has macular degeneration under age 40? And again, precious few. It gets even higher for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, right? It's closer to 60 years, but yet these people have been consuming processed foods their whole life. So you have to, in my view, you absolutely positively must look at population data, epidemiologic data, and look at what the entire population is. And on the whole, it works very well. It's kind of like saying, we know that, for example, Americans have become increasingly obese since the 19th century, right? Obesity was 1.2% in men age 18 to 80 in the 19th century. And what is it today? Obesity in 2018 in the United States is 42.5%. And then we have another 31% of the population that's overweight. So as of 2018, it's 74% of the population's overweight. So if you said, well, we can't look at this data because it's not a randomized controlled trial, that's absurd. Yep. You must look at all this data. You have to know what's happened over time, and anybody could look back at pictures and video of people around 1900, 1911, or 1920, and you'll see that you can almost hardly ever find an overweight or obese person.
And they're eating burgers and fries and butter and ice cream, and they're having a good time, and they're thin. It's
exactly, and they did it
horrible.
all. And when they ate their hamburger and French fries, they cooked the French fries in beef tallow, and that's exactly what
they don't put soybean oil in the bun, do they?
No, they absolutely did not. Right. Yeah, and the desserts were a big thing, and the sugar consumption was a lot higher than people think. In 1890 in the United States, back before there'd never been a heart attack diagnosed in the United States until 1912. Alzheimer's disease had never been diagnosed. Macular degeneration, I don't know that there was any cases in the United States up through 1900. I could go on and on, but in 1890, sugar consumption in the United States was already 10.8% of the food supply. It was already higher than what the World Health Organization recommends today, which is 10%. And by 1907, sugar consumption in the United States was 15.5% of the diet. By 1935, it was, sugar was 22.5% of the diet. But again, what did we, up until 1909, vegetable oil, between 1866, when the first vegetable oil was introduced in the US, which was cottonseed oil, up until 1908, through those years, 1866 to 1908, vegetable oil averaged around 1 to 2 grams per person per day. What is it in 2010? 80 grams per person per day. Wow. So all these things connect together. As we see, as we see the vegetable oil going up, we see all of this disease going up. And it doesn't matter which one you look at.
I think Dr. Ray Peat, the late great Dr. Ray Peat, recommended, I think, no more than 3 or 4 grams of omega-6 a day consumed. Is that right? Is that around where you're at?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that he said that, and I think I would agree with that precisely. So
we're eating 80 grams, is that right? On average?
Yeah, well, no, not of omega-6 LA. We're eating 80 grams of in 2010. Let me go back here, David, to set this properly for the audience. So in 1865, we modeled what Americans would have consumed in their omega-6 linoleic acid, which is linoleic acid, or LA, is the primary omega-6 fat. It accounts for about 90% of the fat in any diet. And so in 1865, in the United States, before we had any vegetable oils, we had none. If you would have said vegetable oil to somebody in 1865, they would have looked at you puzzled. They'd never heard the term. There wasn't such a thing, right? And so anyway, before we had any of those, we modeled the diet, and it turns out that we consumed about 1.1% of our calories as omega-6 linoleic acid. That worked out to be about 2.2 grams. All right. Now, this gradually went up, and I could go through the numbers, but I'll just give the percentages. So by 1909, we were at about 2.2% of our diet as omega-6 linoleic acid. All right. So that basically had doubled. By 1999, we were at, I think it's 19 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid, which is 7 point something% of the diet. And then by 2010, we were at 11.8% of the diet as omega-6 linoleic acid, which is 29 grams a day. So we went from, in 1865, omega-6, 2.2 grams a day, up to 2010, or 2008, excuse me, was 29 grams a day. All right, so it increased 11-fold as you look at it, whether it's from a percentage or from mass. 11-fold increase in our omega-6 linoleic acid. Well, that makes this a toxin. And why is that? Well, because the omega-6 linoleic acid accumulates in our body, in our tissues.
Where?
It accumulates in our cell membranes, it accumulates in our mitochondrial membranes, and it accumulates in our body fat. And we know this from all this data, and we can go into that too. And so what happens is when you accumulate this omega-6 in your body, in your tissues, this sets up an environment that is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And you put those 4 pillars of hazard together, and you've got the recipe for all of this disaster, right? You've got the recipe for everything from obesity, to heart disease, to cancer, and macular degeneration, and on and on and on. Right? Because we're being poisoned, David, is what's happening. And if you look at this, and in the book, we go through toward the end of the book, I go through what's called the Bradford-Hill criteria for causality. And this is how we establish causality. This is exactly what the criteria, there's 9 of them, I think it is, that you look at in order to determine does something meet the criteria for causality? And this is what this is what was done with smoking and lung cancer, for example. And one of the things that you look at is analogous evidence. And analogous evidence is there something similar in the world that also supports your hypothesis that this thing is causing that disease or these many diseases. And when you look at vegetable oils, as I said, one of the primary problems is pro-oxidation. So oxidation is like we're rusting inside. And we can get into the details if you want to. But so this sets up an environment of oxidation. And oxidation is by far worse than inflammation. Inflammation cannot hold a candle to oxidation. Oxidation is extraordinarily destructive. How do I know? Well, for example, so arsenic is a heavy metal. And everybody knows arsenic is extremely toxic. Right. And right, it's rat poison, or it could be, I think. And so why, so how does it do it? How does it cause this? It causes it through oxidation. But people can be slowly poisoned with arsenic, so we can get arsenic toxicity, right? And if you're slowly poisoned with arsenic, guess what happens? You gradually gain weight, you become obese, you become insulin resistant, you develop diabetes, you develop heart failure, you develop cognitive issues, dementia. Guess what? All of the things that we are getting worldwide, it's the same. It's like we're being poisoned. Well, we are being poisoned because, high omega-6, these unsaturated fatty acids that you have in huge numbers in vegetable oils, which we should never have, they're accumulating in our body and setting us up just for oxidation alone. We can go into all the other detail if you want to, but that's it in a nutshell. That's how we're That's how we're going down this disastrous pathway.
Wow. What an indictment. I mean, I'm looking at some of these charts here. I did not know that as of 2010, Japan had 31% obesity in males. That is crazy, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
30,
So this is, yeah, I can go. And since
that's
you mentioned
perfectly
this,
correlates with almost perfectly correlates with the rise of vegetable oil consumption in Japan. I mean, you just look at that.
it
It's
I
almost a
have,
little perfect
yeah,
little.
I'm sorry, David. I just, I get so wound up here, but Japan, I have been stating this since I went public with this theory back in 2016 in regards to macular degeneration at that time. And I've been saying since then that Japan is the quintessential example of all of this because, the data that we have there, it evaluates everything that everybody wants to point the finger at, which is, carbohydrates, processed carbohydrates, sugar, vegetable oil, like in my case, just the diet in general. But if you look at all this data in Japan, for example, the carbohydrate consumption was around 1961 was 84%. This is when they were fantastically healthy, right? And by 2004, that carbohydrate consumption had gone down to 56%. Their fat consumption went up. It went up fourfold. Went from 5% in 1961 to 27% by about 2004. And their sugar consumption went up from 1961. I don't have the exact data handy, but it went up until 1989, and then it progressively went down. Well, okay. So since 1989, in Japan, and the calories are going down. The total calories were at 2837 in 1961, went down to about 1950 by somewhere between 2004 and 2010. All this data is in the book. Yeah. All right. So in Japan, we've got calories going down, carbohydrates going down, sugar going down since 1989, right?
Yep.
Saturated fat is the lowest in the developed world at 7%. Nobody else is that low in the developed world. Seed oils, however, went from 9 grams a day in 1961 to 39 grams a day by 2004. That's a 4.5-fold increase in the vegetable oils, okay? Mm. And their omega-6 went from 1% in 1961 to 7.8% by 2010, I believe it is, all right? Here's what happened to them. Obesity in men doubled, went from 16% to 31.2% between 1978 and 2010, okay? Obesity in men doubled. Breast cancer between 1975 and 1999 alone went up 5-fold. Several other cancers went up 2 to 3-fold or more. Diabetes increased from 0.02% in 1954 to 6.9% in 2007. That's a 345-fold increase, right? Okay. Macular degeneration increased from 0.2% prevalence in the 1970s to 16.37% by 2013. That is an 82-fold increase. So what are we going to attribute all this to? Well, there's only one answer as far as I can see, unless there's some strange, poison or something in the food supply. But, every population that I look at, this is basically what we see. We see, something that is supportive of this theory is what I'm driving at, David. It's not, they're not all like Japan, right? They don't have every place where their calories are going down on carbohydrates and sugar, but that's the case in Japan. And, what's happening to them? They're becoming, sick as the Westerners.
It says metabolic syndrome is 30% of men, 10% of women, and half of Okinawan men are obese as of 2004 in Japan.
Exactly.
What's up with these island populations? They seem to have a high obesity rate when they encounter omega-6. Is that just a genetic predisposition to react to this omega-6 toxin?
Yeah, I think so. I absolutely think so, David. Of all the populations on the planet, I would say Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Americans or Caucasians or whatever you want to call us, we are probably the most resistant to to high omega-6 diets of
Interesting.
all the population. Most every other population is, has greater risk consuming these higher seed oils. And in terms of overall health, like for example, the South Pacific Islanders, or the Pacific Islanders in general, they are exceedingly susceptible to these high omega-6 diets. They were once the most healthy, had the most healthy and revered physiques in the world. This is, all of the explorers, when they saw the Pacific Islanders, like in Tokelau and the Melanesians, the Polynesians, when they found these people, some of them said things like they had godlike physiques, and they were, one explorer said it was like I was transported into the Garden of Eden, and these people were so fantastically, lean and fit and healthy and beautiful. And now the Pacific Islanders have the highest obesity and the highest diabetes in the world. Their obesity in some of the populations is as high as 84 or 85% total obesity and overweight.
What about like the factors of, say, endocrine disruptors from these plastics that everybody's inundated by in their environment and their home and everywhere they go? You've got pollution, you've got EMF, you've got other factors. You've got nutritionally deplete soil, so people are eating food so they're not getting their body nourished, and therefore aren't those just as legitimate, or do we really think the seed oil is the big enchilada here?
Well, I certainly think that it is. And I think all of those things you mentioned, David, are factors. I just don't believe that there's any evidence, and anybody could come to me and try to prove otherwise. And I'm happy to entertain all of those things, but I certainly don't have any evidence that I'm aware of anywhere that it would be like the plastics or EMFs or whatever that are the primary issues. It's not things even like glyphosate, poison from Roundup, that are and the GMOs. We were going down this exact same path before we had a lot of these things, right? Like in the United States, we were, the trajectory has not changed that much since the 1960s. People think that we were fantastically healthy and lean and fit and all that in 1960 in the United States. Well, guess what? Between 1900 and 1960, obesity rose 11-fold. It went from 1.2% in the 19th century to 13.2%, I believe it is, by 1960. That's an 11-fold increase.
So it was still very rare compared to our situation, but it was not rare compared to 1900.
Yeah. I mean, an 11-fold increase, that's enormous. I mean, if you look at any data almost anywhere, when you look at a prevalence of a disease, for example, if it doubles, that's statistically significant. So if obesity had gone from 1.2% in 1900 to 2.4% in 1960, that would have been statistically significant for sure. Right. But it rose 11-fold, and this trajectory continues. Well, I mean, this was long before we had all these other issues like we didn't have EMFs, we didn't have the plastics as much, we didn't have we didn't have GMO. I don't know if I mentioned that, but anyway, the endocrine disruptors, are they there, and are they a factor? Yeah, I think so, but it's just not the primary factor, not in any way, shape, or form.
Another factor you talk about is the immense amount of omega-6 people are getting in traditional chicken and pork, right? I mean, that's a big issue, and you point out Angel Acres Farm, which is ancestrally raised they've given them liver, and this is these Strong Sisters, right, on YouTube.
Yeah.
And right. I'm glad that you brought them out, because they're selling chicken eggs and chicken breasts and meat, and they've measured their amount of linoleic acid versus corn and soy fed chicken. And you got to be careful about that too, because if you're eating immense amounts of chicken, even if you're cooking it without vegetable oils, if you're eating conventionally raised chicken and you're feeding that to your kids, you may be contributing to that omega-6 toxicity down the road, right?
That is exactly right. And that's the next step that people need to take, in my view, once they've eliminated these highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And David, I should mention the names of these, because people get, they want to know, and they need to know. And so the worst of the worst in terms of the vegetable oils would be soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oil. Those are all high omega-6 oils. And the omega-6 linoleic acid in those oils is all above 20%. So it ranges between 20% with canola oil up to 78% with safflower oil.
What about mustard seed oil? Have you looked at that one?
I don't know what it is, but it's high.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly off the top of my head. I think that might be in the book, but they're all very high. None of them are below 20%. None of the seed oils. They're all or the bean oil, soybean oil. Like in the United States, the primary oils consumed in restaurants and fast food, it's almost all soybean and canola. Well, soybean oil is about 54 to 56% omega-6 linoleic acid. Canola oil is about 20% omega-6 linoleic acid. Beef fat, in comparison, would be 100% grass-fed is about 2%. And even if it's grain-fed, it won't go above about probably 3 to 3.5%. And then let's go back to the chicken and pork issue. So animals that are monogastric, like chickens and pigs, when they are fed corn and soy, which is not their natural diet, it's higher in omega-6. And when that's that's all they get to eat, their omega-6 in their body fat goes way up, just like it does in humans, because we're also monogastric. And so their body fat will go up to 20% and beyond omega-6 linoleic acid. And what should it be? Well, when chickens are ancestrally raised, their body fat will be around 2.5% omega-6 linoleic acid, LA. And in pigs, it'll be about 2%. And we know this from studies in Tokelau done way back in the 1970s of animals that were raised traditionally. And even a few that are, like Ashley Armstrong from, who is now raising her chickens correctly on an ancestral diet without corn and soy. Good luck finding those. It's really hard to find those. There are some farmers, ranchers that are doing this, and I applaud them wholeheartedly. And by the way, we don't have any financial relationships with any proprietors of any sort. I mean, I work for 2 nonprofit foundations, and nobody in our organizations earns any income, and we don't have any support from any industry, and we won't accept any. So we don't have any relationships like that. I don't say these things because we're tied to anyone. We're not.
I'm glad that you've done that, because that gives you a level of credibility that's extremely important and necessary.
Yeah,
I applaud you for doing that, because it's with great sacrifice when you don't take an easier. I mean, not that any other route is evil or bad or anything, but it's good to have you out there bringing the data, and you're not, you don't have any relationship to a product or some kind of thing like that, or that's important. We need that. So I'm glad you.
So Angel Acres in Michigan, they are raising chickens correctly. And for example, White Oak Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia, Paul Saladino talks about them a lot. He has a relationship with them. We don't, but they are raising all kinds of animals. I think it's beef. Well, it's beef, it's chicken.
Joel Saladin. Joel Saladin. I just saw him.
No, I don't know him, but I know of his work.
I just saw him last week in Virginia, and he's doing great at Polyface Farms, and they're doing something similar. But I think the Strong Sisters are doing the best in terms of really zoning in on that linoleic acid content in the eggs and meat, which is so important. And that's something that I think will continue to spread in the regenerative agricultural space and the local food industry. I had a horror story one time. I was looking for, I went to a farmer's market, and I kept buying, it said corn and soy free local farmer chicken, and I was like, okay, we can try that. And I kept getting, I said, man, when I had it, I said, this is just a little too it's a little too crispy greasy here. I'm like, what's going on here? And then I went back and looked at the label and it had sunflower oil on it. You know, say they replaced the chicken, they had replaced the chicken feed from soy and corn to a mix that included sunflower oil and some, you know, things like that. I said, oh man, you know, sunflower oil's not, that's like jumping into the fire from the frying pan. So, you know, you got
Yeah,
to
it's
watch out with some of those things. Just let my audience know. Just because it says it's corn and soy free, make sure you check the label to make sure it's not another high linoleic acid food, you know?
yeah, it's just incredible what has happened to our food supply. So in theory, all this is pretty simple, but when you actually have to apply it and get pragmatic about your diet, it's more difficult than one would think. You know, if I always say if you went back to 1865 in the United States or virtually any place in the world, all you would have to do is just eat a variety of foods from whatever it was, wherever you were from, whether you're from Japan or a Pacific island or whatever, you just eat a variety of foods and you'd probably be very, very healthy and without any overweight or chronic disease. But today it's we have a landmine, there's just landmines everywhere in terms of our food supply. As this is what's happened, with commodity agriculture. We just don't have, for the most part, food systems that are geared towards providing us healthy food. I mean, it's geared towards producing revenue. That's
Yeah.
what it's all about for big food.
Do you get in and do you prioritize the endocrine disruptor aspect of seed oils and linoleic acid toxicity as one of the top main drivers of diseases from these products, or do you see the oxidation and inflammation causes as more fundamental to your focus of what's causing diseases from these products?
Yeah, I think it's that ultimately a high omega-6 diet, however you get there, whether it's it's from, and it's most people are they're going to get it from multiple sources. Most of that's going to be the vegetable oils, and then just as you correctly brought up, and then the chicken and the pork that is not ancestrally raised and fed, and then third, nuts and seeds. And so that high omega-6 is driving all of this disease. Well, how does it primarily do it? I don't think it's through endocrine disruption, although that's a role. That is another thing which I don't really go into in any depth in the book at all. In fact, I'm not sure we really cover that, although it is a factor, David. But what happens is the most important causal mechanism for omega-6 to drive overweight is that this breaks the mitochondria, essentially. These are devastating. These high omega-6 diets are devastating to mitochondrial function and ultimately produce mitochondrial dysfunction because they damage the mechanism for us to produce energy. And I don't know if I should go into the detail there. I can if you want me to, but this is disruptive to the production of ATP in the mitochondria. And so ultimately you have a situation where you can't properly then burn fat for fuel because you've broken the electron transport chain system through the high omega-6. And this results in increased reactive oxygen species, which feeds the fuel of this fire. It causes insulin resistance at the cellular level. And then I think it results in an energy partitioning or a macronutrient partitioning because you can no longer properly burn fat for fuel. So in all these disorders, whether it's, we see all this fatty liver disease, which more than half of Americans have now, I think it is. And you see these accumulation of lipid droplets called lipofuscin, for example, in the brain of Alzheimer's patients and in the retina of patients with macular degeneration. But why is it, you've got all these disorders all tied together by insulin resistance, by mitochondrial dysfunction, and by these fat storage situations, right? Whether it's, obesity or heart disease or Alzheimer's or macular degeneration, metabolically, you see very, very similar things going on. It's because the mitochondria are being poisoned, and now they can't properly burn fat for fuel, so they store this fat inside the cell and you have these, you just have this accumulation of fat while the cell puts up stop signs saying, I'm insulin resistant. Why? Because as a cell, it's saying, I'm sick. Don't give me anything else because you poisoned me. I can't take on any more food. I've got all this fat sitting here that I can't burn because I'm sick, and that's a microcosm for what's happening throughout the entire body.
So how do they
So
burn?
that's the
How do they
primary
burn?
mechanism.
How do they use energy? How do they get energy and use it?
So then that's what's interesting is when you break your mitochondrial function through high omega-6 diets, mostly again through seed oils, then you become more carbohydrate dependent. And so people wonder, they think, well, when they're, why is it that there's so much trouble getting into ketogenesis, burning fat for fuel? Why is it so hard for most people that are, not all, but most people that are overweight or obese? Why is it so hard for them to get into ketosis? Why? Well, because they can't properly burn fat for fuel. Why can they not burn fat for fuel? Because they've damaged the mitochondria through a high omega-6 diet. And so now the mitochondria can't burn that fat for fuel properly. So guess what? They're burning carbs for fuel because glycolysis is still working. So they can break down sugars just fine because that's not going on inside the mitochondria.
But then the bioenergetic people say that if you're doing ketosis long term, you end up making it hard for when you try to switch back to eating carbs that you can't process them well. So
that's right.
You can put yourself in a double bind. I don't know how the hell you're even alive at that point. If you can't burn fat and you can't use carbs, how are you even existing at that state? I don't understand.
Well, I mean, this is, this is one of the reasons that, people, that are, gaining weight and getting sick and they're insulin resistant and all that, they're also, they don't have energy. They don't feel like, they don't feel like exercising or doing anything productive, perhaps because they're sick, and they can't, and if they go on a low carb diet, which I don't think is the answer, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that on a very short term basis, in my view. Is what I mean, if I had to make a recommendation, it certainly wouldn't be a long-term thing, but if they want to do that short term, I think that's fine. But long term, if they go, if you go low carb, but you still have significant seed oils in your diet, now the low carbohydrate diet will cause problems with retaining minerals, for example, at the level of the kidney. Because, as Paul Saladino has properly pointed out, insulin is a signal at the level of the kidney to retain minerals. So if you need, so if you're not
so that's one of the reasons why
insulin,
keto people have problems with their sodium, but like their potassium and everything. Interesting.
Absolutely. That's why they start getting potentially all kinds of problems, with mineral deficiencies, and so you get spasms, and you can start getting heart rhythm issues, palpitations, and then even this can even affect your cognitive function, your psyche, depression, anxiety, as your minerals start to deplete. And so
what about people who say when they get on keto, they can learn languages faster, and all those little anecdotal studies that come out that say that?
Yeah, well, here's the thing is, and I have been talking about this since 2019, is the fact that when people go keto or they go low carb, I don't believe that the diet low carb is working at all. If it does work, and it doesn't always work, but when it does, I don't believe it's working because it's low carb. I believe it's working because when you drop your carbohydrates, most people are going to unknowingly drop their omega-6 consumption. Why? Because all the foods that are high carb are associated. That's where they're associated with the omega-6 oils, right? The vegetable oils. So when you take out wheat and you take out, rice and pasta, those kind of things, and potatoes,
Yeah.
those are the things that restaurants, fast food, and processed foods are all associated with. They all run together. So if you just start taking out willy-nilly carbohydrates out of your diet, you're probably going to reduce your vegetable oils. Not definitely, but most people will.
Unless
Where
you're
they go
dousing
wrong
your
is
salads with soybean oil dressing every day, then you're going to be
that's
in
right. And
trouble.
so, for example, women who go low carb and they're eating lots of salads, they're headed for disaster. It's absolute disaster, and I've seen that so many times.
That's like the worst diet you could do, really, at that
It
point.
is.
Oh,
Yeah.
so let's talk about the healing in this as we land the plane. What are the healing aspects that we can do to heal from this catastrophe? Because and at the end, I want to give a little preview about what you're going to be doing with your research going forward and everything, because that's exciting, and I want to hear an update on that for our audience. But just for the healing side of things here, obviously you're
Yeah.
not a big fan of low carb and keto for a long term fix for this, but that's a big question mark for a lot of people, and it's something that I'm trying to navigate with my audience, is to try to understand what are the
Yeah.
best ways now that we know that these things are so disastrous. How do we heal from them completely and move on, and actually have a really abundant life as best as we can.
Right. Yeah, and that's and I detail that in great deal in this next book. Again, it's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution, and that's at the last couple of chapters is
Yeah.
all the plan for that. And but the plan in a nutshell, people have to understand that the half-life of omega-6 linoleic acid or any fatty acid in the body fat is 600 to 680 days. Well, that's roughly 2 years. So it's going to take a long time for us to reduce our omega-6 in our body fat. It's, if you go to a completely ancestral diet and you get all the oils and the high omega-6 other foods we've talked about out of your diet, it'll be probably 3 years before you're at an ancestral level of omega-6 in your body fat. So it's not going to happen overnight, although you will have health benefits overnight. The very first day you will have less inflammation from going a low omega-6, and you'll gradually, and I've seen people have hugely beneficial improvements in their health just in a matter of a few weeks or a few months. So it is impressive even early on in some cases, but just realize it's a long-term situation. And so the mainstay of how do we get to this? Well, it's an ancestral diet, and that basically, and we haven't talked about this very much, but that does mean that you, for the most part, remove refined flours, refined sugars, and vegetable oils. And I'm not, so I'm not defending here, refined flours and sugars. They're part of the problem. And I think people should try to get those out of their diet as well, because then you will just naturally increase your nutrients. So do that. That's the first big step towards getting healthy. Just, get rid of the processed foods, and just remember it's refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils. Get all the oils out of your diet, and go back to using
what about like a cane
fat.
sugar? What about cane sugar? Is that a refined sugar in your book?
Yeah, it's refined, absolutely. But I don't fear sugar like that whatsoever. I just keep in mind I use sugar in small amounts. I mostly get my sugar from honey or from maple syrup. Those are natural sugars, and so I don't add a
You eat
lot
a
of
lot of
other
fruit
sugar to
sugar?
my
Do you eat a
diet.
lot of fruit juices and fruits?
I consume a little bit of fruit juice. Fresh squeezed orange juice, not in large quantities. So I don't consume a whole lot of it, but I do consume some. And I consume I consume potatoes, white rice, and pasta. All and so all of
What
these
kind of
are as
pasta?
close.
Do you do like a whole grain
So
pasta or something? Or
so I currently I'm not sure. I've had my own health issues throughout life, and I don't know for sure if I'm gluten sensitive. I'm still trying to figure this out. I mean, I've been testing all these things on myself for years, and I'm still trying to figure this out. But I mostly avoid gluten, so So in terms of, pasta, like I'll use organic corn, quinoa, I think it is, type of
Or maybe a
pasta.
rice noodle, like a white rice noodle, like a
I don't do those, but I think those would be
yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't personally do those. Yeah,
Is there a
but
reason why, or you just don't prefer it, or no?
no, I think they're fine. No, I
Yeah.
think they'd be fine. Yeah, absolutely fine. I think, yeah, rice is fine. White rice is absolutely fine. I think it's one of the, yeah, it's fairly nutrient deficient, but yeah, I just, when you look at the fact that, for example, the Japanese up through 1960, their diet was 84% carbohydrate, about 5% fat, and the rest was so about another 11% of protein. And where did that come from? 80+% of it was coming from white rice with a little bit of vegetables and fish, and that's it.
How are they
That's what
getting
their
all their
diet was.
minerals? How are they getting all their minerals?
But
Yeah.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it's staggering what the body can do with just
Yeah.
even with white rice.
Yeah.
So as long as you leave out the dangerous products, now I'm not advising anybody here that I'm not saying we should be consuming 80% white rice diets. That's not the point here. The point is that, I think white rice is a safe food for most people. It's one of the least immunogenic foods there would be that are in the, plant/carbohydrate category, meaning, it's least likely to cause, cause some kind of a immune reaction, right? Or a gut reaction. It's extremely well tolerated. So I think probably most people can consume white rice safely. I'm not saying they should make it 80% of their diet like the Japanese did. Not at all, but I think it can be a healthy part of the diet.
How about
And
dairy?
I think carbohydrates are really important to the
Yeah.
diet.
Like
I
hundreds of carbs a
absolutely.
day, you think is healthy? Like
How
400?
much?
Do you have a number range that you recommend as a doctor? Or you don't get into that.
Here's the thing: is I don't think there's any reason for any of us to suggest that we ought to be following some percentage on our macronutrients at all. I do think that, that I don't think that going low protein is the best thing for people to do. There
What's
are
low
there
protein? Like,
like below. I think anything below what Americans do, which is about 13% of the diet, I think it's too low for most people. I think most people, given that the huge majority of people are already severely nutrient deficient and they're in a toxic state, I think they'd be better off increasing their meat and good quality, a non-corn and soy-fed egg consumption, for example, and butter, and cheeses or dairy, raw dairy. All those things would be very beneficial for people because that's where the fat soluble vitamins would be, and lots of other nutrients and healthy fats. And so but I don't think that I should ever be advising at a public level people to consume some certain macronutrient ratio. It makes no sense because the Maasai warriors of Kenya and Tanzania, they consumed 66% animal fat diet with about 14%, I think it's 14% carbohydrate. So they're low carbohydrate, right? Extremely healthy, right? But the Okinawans, their diet, 84% carbohydrate, 5% fat, and 10 or 11% protein, and they're extremely healthy, right? And you just keep going with this. And no matter what you look at, you've got macronutrient ratios all over the board with whatever populations you look at. But they all, in all these native traditional diets, they've eliminated what? Mostly, refined flour, sugars, and vegetable oils. They don't have any of those for the most part. But anyway, so I don't think I should be, promulgating a specific macronutrient ratio, and I don't think it's
does that mean that
appropriate to
people
say
can eat a high fat diet, saturated fat, lots of fruits, rice, meats, and as long as they get rid of the linoleic acid, they'll just naturally go to a normal weight? Or is it like once you've had decades of dysfunction, you have to modify all those other things too in certain proportions because you have to heal from the damage for many years,
Yeah, I think most people are going to, just as you said, with that diet, I think most people are going to start they're going to lose weight fast, and they're going to get healthy fast. And if they don't, then I think that the next step is, and I've got this is in the book, is to do a lot of laboratory testing. And you could depending on what your budget is, if you can afford it or you can get your insurance to cover it, you can do this either right away or you can do it after you've gone to an ancestral diet for a while. But the next step is to test all sorts of things. And I won't have time to go into all that today, but you get to test all your vitamins, all your minerals in the proper ways, and you'll need somebody to help you interpret these. So you need a functional medicine practitioner probably to help interpret those. But I think that'd be the next step, because for example, if you have deficiencies of magnesium or vitamin B2 or B6, I believe it is, just for example, these are things that can drive insulin resistance. And so, so it's not just omega-6 linoleic acid, or seed oils that are driving insulin resistance and all this disease. There are definitely, absolutely other factors. And, but again, you got to get the big picture right first, then start narrowing in on the details.
Well, very good. Dr. Chris, I really appreciate your time. And give us an update. I know that you are, ambitious in your desire to do some fantastic scientific studies on populations before we lose those abilities to do those things, right? Can you give us an update about that?
Yes, absolutely. So just by the way, the foundations that I work for are Ancestral Health Foundation and Cure AMD Foundation, and that AMD is regards age-related macular degeneration. And through these foundations, what we hope to do is really for me to walk in the footsteps of Weston A. Price, but in a 21st century version type of research. What we want to do is evaluate populations that are still consuming their native traditional diets and compare and contrast them to their genetic cohorts in the cities who have westernized their diets. And we would do this by analyzing their food and by analyzing biometrics individually. And that means both blood studies and adipose fatty acid studies. We'll take biopsies of their adipose to prove that those in the cities have higher omega-6 in their body fat, just like, is what happens to people all over that are consuming vegetable oils, for example. But what we want to do is we want to study 5 or 6 populations around the world that in just as I described here. But that's a very long-term plan. That's going to take a number of years and many millions of dollars. So people can support these missions, the goals of our organizations, if they want to give to either of those foundations.
Well, very good. And also, again, check out the book. It's out now, The Ancestral Diet Revolution by Dr. Chris Knobbe and Suzanne Alexander. It's always great to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Best of luck in this new endeavor of this new chapter, and I hope that we'll see a lot of healing from this. So let's see that happen, right?
Yeah, sounds great, David. Thank you so much.